Hi, this is Chris Young. Welcome to episode 52 of Contemplating Life. I recently saw an interview with MSNBC commentator Rachel Maddow talking about her new book titled Prequel. It's about Nazi influence in U.S. government during World War II. Her colleague Chris Hayes asked her how she got into the topic. She said she'd planned to do a book about present-day anti-Semitism, but after researching its roots, she ended up back in the late 1930s and 40s. She said she suffers from a condition where every story she tells, she wants to begin with, well, an asteroid hit the Earth, and then the dinosaurs died, and then... Okay, I suffer from the same condition. When I tell a story, I always want to start at the beginning. For me, context is everything. You've already seen this in previous episodes. For example, I couldn't tell my history of attending IUPUI without telling the history of IUPUI itself. In last week's episode, I talked about my ongoing struggles to be able to get out into theater and see movies. It took everything I had not to start the story with. The first movie I ever saw was... However, I can no longer resist the urge to scratch that itch. So rather than continue speculating about when I'll see my last picture show, let's go back to the beginning and talk about the first picture show. This episode is all about my history with the movies for as far back as I can remember. Covering my history as a movie buff is going to take more than one episode if I'm going to cover it in the kind of excruciating detail that I like to tell stories. So this is the first of a multi-part series. This time I'll put my disclaimer up front. Last week I misremembered the order in which I'd seen some films over 40 years ago. Now we're going to go back 60 plus years. So I make no guarantees about the accuracy of this narrative. I don't know what was the first movie I ever saw, but I'm confident it was at the Lafayette Road Drive-In Theater. The drive-in sat in a 19-acre triangular lot bounded by 38th Street, Lafayette Road, and Georgetown Road. It opened in August 1953, before I was born in July 55. It closed in 1982, when it was demolished and a strip mall was constructed there. My earliest memories of the venue date back to when I was perhaps 3 or 4 years old. In those days, West 38th Street was just 2 lanes. There were no street lights, no fast food places, or shopping centers. Lafayette Square Mall, that was north and east of Lafayette Road, wasn't constructed until 1968. I also seem to recall that the 38th Street Bridge over White River was not yet constructed in my early days of visiting the drive-in. So 38th Street was not the major east-west thoroughfare that it is today. The nearest homes were maybe a block and a half or 2 blocks away, with the rear of the homes facing the drive-in. I think there was a small wooded area blocking their view of the screen. But as the area became more developed and the trees were torn down, residents complained that the theater started showing R-rated movies. They said their children could look out their bedroom windows and see naked women on the screen. I remember there was a small playground down front near the screen, with swings and slides for the kids to play on before the feature started. One of the swings had a baby seat that had a backrest, armrest, and a bar across the front. There was a strap that would go between your legs to keep you from sliding out. On at least one occasion, my mom was able to get me into that seat. It was the first and only time I was ever able to play on a swing set. I also have a memory of going back a second time and insisting that I get to play in the swing, but I had outgrown the seat, and we could not get my legs underneath the crossbar in the front. In my quest to recall the first movie I ever saw, I've racked my brain and I've done lots of research on IMDb. The most likely candidate is The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, featuring stop-motion animation by legendary animator Ray Harryhausen. According to IMDb, Sinbad was released in December '58. That would have made me 3.5 years old. My family moved into the Eagledale neighborhood, just 7 blocks south of the drive-in May of '59. I always presumed we didn't go to that drive-in before moving into the neighborhood. Then again, even at our previous home on West 34th Street near White River and the canal, the Lafayette Road Drive-In would have been the closest to our home. I have very few memories of living in that old house on 34th Street, but I suppose a cool movie like that would have made a sufficient impression on me that I remember it even at that very young age. I wondered if perhaps I was thinking of a different Ray Harryhausen classic, such as Jason and the Argonauts, which wasn't released until '63. We probably saw both of these films, but I'm fairly certain we did see Sinbad because I recall it featured a battle with the legendary monster Cyclops, and I definitely remember seeing that film at the drive-in. Now, I'm not ready to claim that this was the absolute first film I ever saw, because I also have a vague memory that perhaps we saw a trailer for that film, and my dad said, "Wow, we definitely need to come back and see that one." Then again, I could be remembering the trailer for Jason and the Argonauts. While we're talking about Harryhausen films, I'm absolutely positive we saw a film called The Valley of Grange in the summer of 1969. That film featured a bunch of cowboys who discover a lost valley filled with dinosaurs. They capture one, bring it back to civilization, and put it in a circus, where it kills the circus elephant and several innocent people. We had my 5-year-old sister, Carol, with us. She wasn't scared of the dinosaur. Quite the contrary, when they killed the dinosaur, in the end, she cried. We tried to explain to her he was a very bad dinosaur who killed lots of people. She didn't care. They didn't need to kill it. I recently asked her if she remembered the incident. She said she didn't have direct memory of the movie, but she's heard us tell the story for many years, and that's how she remembers it. I'm about 90% sure we also saw Ben-Hur in 1959 with Charlton Heston at the drive-in. It seems strange, however, that Ben-Hur and Sinbad were released in November and December. I kind of find it improbable we would go to the drive-in in the middle of the winter. Somewhere I had a vague memory that we went to the drive-in in cold weather, and they would provide you with a small electric space heater that you could plug into your cigarette lighter rather than run your motor with the heat on. Unsure of that memory, I posted a message on a Facebook group called I Grew Up in Eagledale to see if anyone else had more certain memories of the Lafayette Road Drive-In. One person confirmed that she remembered that they would provide you with a heater, and another one confirmed that the drive-in was indeed open year-round. On the other hand, just because IMDb reports when a movie was released, it's quite likely it went to indoor theaters first, and drive-ins might not have shown it until summer. So I really don't know when I saw these films. In 1960, my dad bought a 1959 Plymouth. He was able to make the down payment on the car because we won $1,000 in a Knights of Columbus raffle. We used to put $1 in every week. It was one of those cars that was typical of the time period, with the huge fins on the rear fenders. And it also had a large, sloping rear window. See the YouTube version of this podcast for the photo of such a car. Not the one we had, but one just like it. When we would go to the drive-in, it was typically a double feature. I'd be allowed to watch the first movie, but they would put me in the back of the car on a shelf above the rear seat underneath that large window. I was supposed to try to sleep during the second movie, and many times I did. But mostly I would lie on that shelf underneath the glass dome and stare at the stars and wonder how they worked. I have distinct memories of asking my dad, if the stars are suns, just like our sun, only really far away, and the sun and the stars are in outer space, how can they burn when there's no air up there? He didn't have an answer, but I vowed to figure it out one day. It was the start of my fascination with science, especially astronomy, and I trace it all the way back to staring out that window of the '59 Plymouth at the Lafayette Road Drive-In. I can't remember all the films I saw at the drive-in, but there are three that I remember quite distinctly because I bootlegged them. Of course, this was long before you could buy your own video camera, so I couldn't bootleg the film itself. But I could bootleg the soundtrack. For my 8th birthday in July 1963, I got a small reel-to-reel tape recorder with 3-inch reels. This was before the widespread use of cassette recorders. In June 1964, I took my tape recorder to the drive-in with me to see Mary Poppins. By this time, we had traded in the old Plymouth for a Chevy Corvair Greenbrier van, which allowed me to sit in my wheelchair. I had a lap tray that sat across the armrest of my wheelchair, and I set the tape recorder on the tray. I put the microphone up near the movie drive-in speaker. The quality of the tape recorder, the cheap microphone, and the horrible sound quality of the drive-in movie speaker produced a really bad recording, but I didn't care. I had a free recording of every song in Mary Poppins. A friend of mine had the soundtrack album, but I claimed that my recording was superior because it included sound effects that were not in his album. For example, when Mary is singing A Spoonful of Sugar, she's magically putting away the children's clothes and toys. In my recording, you could hear the dresser drawers opening and closing. A month later, I also recorded everything from the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night, as well as a year later when I recorded the soundtrack from the Beatles film Help. These 3 tapes were my prized possessions at the time. I have no idea whatever happened to them. Sometime in the early 1970s, I got my first cassette recorder with a built-in AM/FM radio. I would use it to bootleg the latest hit songs off of WNAP-FM, The Wrath of the Buzzard. It was just mono and not stereo, but the quality of recording off of FM was pretty good. I don't recall bootlegging the soundtrack of any other films except those 3, but then again there weren't many musicals that interested me in those days. I talked to my sister Carol about her earliest memories of the movies, and she recalled seeing The Sound of Music at an indoor theater. But I think she went with my grandmother, as I never saw that film until it made it to TV. And I'm not certain I've ever seen it all the way through. The first movie I ever saw in an indoor theater was in early 1964. The Marion County Muscular Dystrophy Foundation hosted an event where all of the families were invited to the Indiana Theater at 140 West Washington, downtown. We saw the film How the West Was Won in Cinerama format. Cinerama was sort of the 1950s and 60s version of IMAX. It was shot using 3 separate 35mm cameras whose field of view slightly overlapped. The 2 outer cameras were crisscrossed such that the right-hand camera pointed left and the left-hand camera pointed right. It was also projected that same way, using 3 standard 35mm projectors which projected onto a large curved screen with a 146-degree viewing angle. It also featured 7-channel surround sound, with 5 speakers spread behind the screen and 2 speakers in the rear corners of the theater. The sound was recorded on magnetic tape rather than optically recorded, as were most soundtracks of the day. There were some areas at the far edge of the theater where there were no seats, so you could sit in your wheelchair. But it wasn't a very good viewing angle, especially considering the curvature of the screen. So rather than sit with the other kids in wheelchairs on the side of the theater, my dad lifted me out of my wheelchair, and I sat in a regular theater seat between Mom and Dad near the middle of the theater for a good view. Watching a film on such a huge screen indoors with high-quality sound was an amazing experience compared to what I was accustomed to at the drive-in. There was a dark red curtain in front of the screen when you entered the theater. When the lights went down, the curtain would open to reveal the gigantic, curved Cinerama screen. The film began with an overture of music. IMDb reports the runtime was 2 hours 44 minutes, which was huge in those days. So much so that there was an intermission and more music to introduce the second half. I remember the intermission music included the Civil War era song, When Johnny Comes Marching Home. I was so enveloped by the surround sound that I started singing along in that sort of embarrassing way that you sing out loud when you have headphones on and you don't realize people can hear you. My dad had to tell me to shut up and just listen to the music. Especially memorable were the scenes of a raft going down a rapids in a river and then partially breaking apart. Also, there was a buffalo stampede that goes right over the cameras. I think that initial experience with Cinerama planted a seed that makes me such a huge fan of IMAX today. Like IMAX, the first films shot in Cinerama format were documentaries, and 5 such films were made from 1952 through 1958. Only 2 regular feature films were ever shot in the 3-strip Cinerama format: The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm and How the West Was Won, both released in 1962. Filmmakers discovered it was difficult to compose a scene using the 3-camera process because any objects close to the cameras would be distorted if they went across the seams where the cameras overlapped their field of view. They took steps to try to hide the overlap, but it was still visible in the films. Documentary 3-strip Cinerama films were shot and projected at 26 frames per second, but feature films were shot in the standard 24 frames per second. Cinerama had an aspect ratio of 2.59 to 1. That means that the width of the image was 2.59 times its height. However, when projected, they often slightly cropped the top and the bottom of the image to hide some distortion anomalies, giving a projected aspect ratio of 2.65 to 1. For comparison, HDTV today uses a 16 by 9 aspect ratio, which comes out 1.77 to 1. The 3-camera Cinerama format was later replaced with systems called Ultra Panavision 70 and Super Panavision 70, both of which were shot on 65mm film to produce 70mm prints. Some of these films were marketed as Cinerama, even though they didn't use the original 3-camera process, because they still used the curved Cinerama screen. In fact, the river raft scene in How the West Was Won was shot using a single camera Ultra Panavision 70 and then transferred to the 3-strip Cinerama format. Ultra Panavision 70 has an aspect ratio of 2.67 to 1, which was wider than the 3-strip Cinerama. It uses anamorphic lenses to compress the aspect ratio during filming and then uncompress it during projection. Among notable films shot in Ultra Panavision 70, but marketed as shown in Cinerama, were It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, 1963, which I saw at the drive-in, The Greatest Story Ever Told, from 1965, and The Battle of the Bulge in 1965. Probably the most famous and most effective use of the widescreen of Ultra Panavision 70 was Ben-Hur in 1959 and the iconic chariot race. It was never marketed as Cinerama, however. As I previously mentioned, I saw Ben-Hur at the drive-in, and it was presumably from a 35mm print. The most recent use of Ultra Panavision 70 was Quentin Tarantino's 2015 film, The Hateful Eight. It was shot on 65mm film and camera to produce 70mm prints. He paid extra to help the theaters show the film in Ultra Panavision 70 format wherever possible. Several recent films have been shot using Ultra Panavision 70 lenses on digital cameras. For example, Rogue One, A Star Wars Story in 2016, and Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame in 2018 and 19, all of which I saw in modern digital theaters. Another similar format is Super Panavision 70. It uses spherical lenses to create an aspect ratio of 2.20 to 1. Among the notable films shot in Super Panavision 70 but marketed as Cinerama were Grand Prix in 1967, which I saw in the drive-in, 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968, and Ice Station Zebra in 1968. Many other notable films were shot in Super Panavision 70, but were not marketed as Cinerama because they were projected onto flat screens. When Ultra or Super Panavision films were shown in Cinerama theaters using a single projector, they had to use special optics to get the projectors to conform to the highly curved Cinerama screens. I saw Ice Station Zebra with my parents at the Indiana Theater in Cinerama again as the guest of Muscular Dystrophy Foundation. I begged my parents to take me to see 2001 A Space Odyssey in Cinerama. But from some things they heard about it, they thought perhaps it was too adult for me. I didn't get to see 2001 until it was shown on TV many years later. Then it was re-released to theaters, and I was able to see it on a small 2-screen theater in the Speedway Shopping Center. It was described as Super Panavision 70 format, but my guess is it was probably just a 35mm print. I was always disappointed I never got to see it on a huge screen, but at least seeing that one version in the theater was better than the 3x4 standard definition TV screen. Years later, when seeing these films on TV, I never could understand why you could see the vertical seams dividing the Cinerama image into 3 parts on How the West Was Won, yet you could not see any seams on Ice Station Zebra and 2001 Space Odyssey. It wasn't until I began researching this episode that I learned that only 2 Cinerama feature films were actually shot in the 3-strip format, and the others were shot with a single camera and projected with a single projector onto the curved Cinerama screens. So that finally explains a lifelong mystery of why there were never any seams in these other so-called Cinerama movies. See the links in the description to Wikipedia articles on all of these formats and other similar formats of the area, such as Todd AO. These articles include more extensive lists of famous films which were shot and shown in these widescreen formats. Before we leave the drive-in movie era completely, we have to talk about the 1969 film Winning, starring Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, and Robert Wagner. Newman and Wagner played race car drivers who were rivals. Much of the film was shot on location at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, just a couple of miles south of the Lafayette Road Drive-In. My entire family has been lifelong fans of the Indy 500, so this was a must-see film. It included actual race footage from crashes from the 1966 Indy 500 and from other races. If that wasn't enough to make the film important in my movie-going history, it was also the first film I ever saw that had a sex scene. Well, sort of a sex scene. The film was rated M for mature audiences. Today it would probably rate PG-13 at worst, and perhaps only PG. Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward, who were married in real life, played a couple who were lovers in the film. She has an affair with Robert Wagner. There's a scene in the Speedway Motel where Newman walks in on Wagner in bed with Woodward. Wagner was on top of Woodward in bed, but they were under the covers and there was no nudity involved. Even though I was 14 years old, I was pretty uneducated about things, and it prompted me to ask, what were they doing? I don't quite recall what sort of evasive answer my parents gave me. The last movie I ever saw at the drive-in was not at Lafayette Road, but it was at the Tibbs Drive-In, which is the only drive-in movie still in operation in Indianapolis. I went with some of the guys from my neighborhood. They drove my van. It was the 1970 Roger Corman gangster film, Bloody Mama. Roger Corman is known as the king of the B movies. This film starred Shelley Winters as real-life gangster Ma Barker and a then-unknown 27-year-old actor you might have heard of. His name was Robert De Niro. Do we know him? Yeah. Anyway, not only was it a bloody, gory gangster movie, but Ma Barker routinely had sex with her adult sons and their friends. The sons would argue over whose turn it was to spend the night with Mama. None of them wanted to do it. It's your turn. No, it's not. It's your turn. The argument went on. I'll never forget one line from the movie. When one of the Barker boys, played by Robert De Niro, overdosed and died, Mama was hysterical. She shouted out to her son Herman, who was out alligator hunting with a Tommy gun. On his return, she shouted, "Your brother's dead. It was that dope he put in his arm." Herman Barker, played by Don Stroud, calmly replies,
"Just bury him deep. A lot of animals around here."
"Just bury him deep. There's a lot of animals around here." Typical Roger Corman B-movie fare. Some people consider it a cult classic. This episode's getting quite long, so I think it's a good place to split it. In next week's episode, I'll recount more of my history of enjoying movies. We'll focus on the evolution of special effects, which have always fascinated me. In fact, most of the times I purchased DVDs of films, it wasn't because I planned to watch them over and over again. It was so I could watch the making of features that explain how the special effects were created. And I wanted to listen to the director's commentary for behind the scenes stories. As always, if you find this podcast educational, entertaining, enlightening, or even inspiring, considering sponsoring me on Patreon for just $5 a month. You'll get early access to the podcast and other exclusive content. Although I'm in financial struggles, I'm not really in this for the money, but every little bit helps. As always, my deepest thanks to my financial supporters. It shows how much you care and appreciate what I'm doing. That means more to me than words can express. If you can't provide financial support, please post links and share this podcast on social media so I can grow my audience. I just want more people to hear my stories. All of my back episodes are available. I encourage you to check them out if you're new to the podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or other feedback, please feel free to comment on any of the platforms where you find the podcast. Tell me your stories about the first movie you ever saw, or take a nostalgic look back at the drive-in movies. I'll see you next week as we continue contemplating life. Until then, fly safe, everyone.